Good day everyone and welcome to another edition of Crapper. So what's the first prog album then? It's a debate which has been had several times before. One thinks of Thomas S. Kuhn, the American philosopher of science, with his theory of paradigms. The history of science is not continuous, as many people assume. It's actually discontinuous. And it moves in paradigms. There's shifting between paradigms, which occurs every so often. And a paradigm begins where there's a crisis in a previous paradigm, and then you have this sort of like a revolutionary moment, like a new idea, which opens up the new paradigm. And of course, here we're talking about the opening of the Prog paradigm. And the question is, what's the revolutionary idea? Well, some people mention King Crimson, in the Court of the Crimson King, which I think is fair enough. Although I'm not sure whether In the Court of the Crimson King really can be said to open a new paradigm, because it's such a singular thing, that album. And it involves long pieces, but not exactly large-scale writing in the way that we came to expect later on with the sort of in the classical period of prog bands, including the Apollo and Dionysus of the movement, Genesis and Yes, of course, but also, Gentle Giant, Curved Air, and the prog edition of Jethro Tull, right? Now, my own personal feeling is that what really sets up that second period is the album Five Bridges by the Nice, because it's got a kind of large-scale writing, which is where all the elements are integrated, and they're not just extended. They're not pieces which have shorter pieces which have been extended, as it were, but they're written as longer pieces. And the main example being side one of Five Bridges, namely the title track, the Five Bridges Suite. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. The Five Bridges album, right? First of all, who were the Nice? Well, of course, as many people know, Keith Emerson, pre-Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And he was on keyboards, of course, and then you had Lee Jackson on bass and vocals. Brian Davidson on drums, and also David O'List was in the first incarnation of the band, album one. I think he left after album one, actually. By the time of Five Bridges, there's just three of them left, just the trio left, right? They did 4 albums. The Thoughts of Emily's Davjak, Ars Vita Longa, that's Ars, not Ars. Ars Longa Vita Brevis, there you are. Not an expert on Latin, as you can tell. Was the second album, and third album was The Nice, and the fourth album was Five Bridges. And first album is more psych prog. It's brilliant, the first album, but it's shorter pieces, and again, with sort of, when they get longer, it's because they contain improvisational sections. The second album, sort of, side one is kind of shorter pieces, shorter, more poppy, again, psychedelic prog pieces. And then you have an epic on side two. So strictly, Five Bridges wasn't the first epic they did, but I think that they're different. I think the first epic, which is the title track again, Ars Longa Vita Brevis, Artist Long Life is Short, it's not as successful, partly because the musical ideas aren't as good, but also because I think that they've decided to write a long piece and they're just filling it in with like different bits and pieces. Whereas I think Five Bridges works the other way round. They sort of they build it up out of small sections and small developments, and then gradually it becomes a side-long piece. Their third album, The Nice, is kind of outtakes. The first side is studio outtakes, and the second side is live outtakes. And second side is brilliant of that album. First side is a bit weak, I think. And then, as I say, Five Bridges was the fourth album. And it's got this Five Bridges suite on side one, and then 4 shorter pieces on side two. Also mainly recorded live, although the final track is a studio track, so it seems. Little bit of empirical information. Five Bridges was released in June 1970, but it was actually recorded in late 1969. Mainly recorded in Fairfield Halls in Croydon, Surrey. The theme of the album is Newcastle, right? So it's a great idea to record an album about Newcastle, just south of London. It was commissioned by the Newcastle Arts Festival. Certainly the side one piece. I don't know, maybe the concert as well. This was in the days when rock bands used to get commissions. Imagine that. You know, one thinks of Henry Cow getting an Arts Council grant. Because, of course, today musicians are just expected to starve. Now, the theme of the album, or at least the first side, is the Five Bridges of Newcastle. And there's also supposed to be five bridges between rock band and classical orchestra, something like that. You know, little bit like perhaps Concerto for Group and Orchestra by Deep Purple. Although I think that's pretty much an unadulterated catastrophe, which, sorry, Deep Purple fans, which this isn't, in my view, because this is good. Yeah, we'll get back to the bridges between the orchestra and band in a second. It did very well, bit of a hit, this album, number 2 in the UK, and 197 in the US, which is less good, but anyway. Now, Paul Stump, in his weirdly titled book, The Music's All That Matters, says, and I quote, when speaking of this album, "The textures of both genres are sold short. The net result is like listening to two radios simultaneously, one tuned to Radio Luxembourg, the other to Radio 3. Rock doesn't expand its vocabulary, and classical sees its terms of expression rudely elbowed aside." Now, this is a terse comment. I think it's not quite right. It might be true that Keith Emerson wanted to attempt a synthesis between band and orchestra, but I don't really think it should be thought of as a synthesis, because it's not, basically. I think what it is a brilliant rock track with orchestral ornamentation, essentially. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. A word on the cover. It's by Hypnosis, the great Hypnosis. It's a treated picture of one of the Newcastle bridges reflected against itself. You may be able to see it. So what we have there is, the idea of something empirical being twisted against itself and twisted into abstraction, which is basically how the plastic arts are supposed to work, not to mention all art. I did wonder whether this cover is like a joke about the plurality of bridges. He's got just the one bridge made multiple. It's not 5, but it is at least 2. The other thing that occurred to me on this front was that at this time, 1969, Maoism was in its apogee in the West. And one divides into two, of course, is the fundamental dialectical principle of Maoism. So I don't know if it's a reference to that. I mean, I believe that Lee Jackson may have been something of a Maoist, because according to Keith Emerson, he used to carry a copy of Mao's Little Red Book around with him, otherwise known as The Thoughts of Chairman Mao, which the title of the first Nice album, The Thoughts of Emily Stavjak, it apparently was a reference to. So the first Nice album has a Maoist title, which is interesting. The only flaw in this theory is that Lee Jackson didn't design the cover. But anyway. Now, okay. Side 1. As I said, Five Bridges Suite covers the whole side. I think it's an 18-minute triumph, this. As I said, it's one of the first side-long epics. And this is, not the first one even that the Nice did, but I think it's a much more definitive attempt. It's structured weirdly on record, on CD. I first got this record on CD, but it's the same. The same problem arises on streaming services, I've noticed, because the sections of the piece don't seem to correspond to the tracks, which is confusing. So let's just lay them out. So Bridge 1 is called Fantasia, and it's the orchestra with some solo piano interludes from Mr. Emerson. Bridge 2, entitled Second Bridge, predictably. This is the nice, just the trio on their own, right? Bridge 3 is called the chorale, and this is the Lee Jackson ballad, basically, with orchestral accompaniment, right? Interspersed with some trio interludes, including Keith Emerson on piano again. He happens to be playing the piano at that point. Bridge 4 is called the High Level Fugue, and that's the piano solo bit over some drumming, and that's quite short, that bit. And then Bridge 5 is the reprise of Bridge 2, right, which is the nice, this time with added brass and saxophone, I believe. I mean, actually, I think the best way to think about this sequence is that Bridge 1 is like a colourful introduction. Bridge 2 is where the track really starts. Bridge 3 is like a beautiful interlude, still in the rock idiom, essentially. Bridge 4 is an experimental interlude, which is necessary for prog rock. If you're having a long prog rock track, it's customary that at some point something very weird happens in the middle. And Bridge 5 is the ending, which reiterates the beginning of what I would call the track proper, which is Bridge 2, right? In other words, what we're dealing with here is a conventional prog epic that includes an orchestral introduction, really. Is there any overlap between the orchestra and the band in terms of the motifs? A tiny bit, thus justifying the opening. I mean, I think they're a bit perfunctory, these bits, but they're not unpleasant. In some ways, they're part of the sort of compositional colour that one sees creeping back in Emerson, Lake and Palmer stuff later on, like, Carnival 9, things like that. Anyway, let's go through it a bit. The Fantasia, Bridge 1. I think this is really like an overture to a suite, which might have been slightly out of fashion by this point in musical history. I mean, I also think, it's an orchestra playing, but I mean, I don't think this would have been of much interest to serious classical music fans, who probably wouldn't have been much interested in then either. They probably would have been listening to, I don't know, Stockhausen or something by 1969. Or maybe in the British context, I don't know, David Bedford or John Tavener, people like that. They were quite hip, weren't they, at that time? However, there was a more recent tradition at that time of orchestral suites in the British context. Malcolm Arnold. The Planet Suite, of course, by Holst. But nevertheless, bit retro, all of this. It's also eclectic, I think, to the point of pastiche. I mean, it starts Baroque and then goes sort of into a sort of Copelandian or Stravinskyan post-romanticism, which is probably also surplus to requirements by that point. Actually, sometimes I even think it sounds a bit like film soundtrack music. But anyway, that's another matter. The other thing here to mention is that the orchestra are playing very badly. They seem to be out of time with themselves at a certain point. Paul Stumpy, again, describes them as second-rate, which I think is fair. This orchestra actually, incidentally, apparently doesn't exist anymore, the Symphony of London. I wonder if they gave up after this performance, actually. And I even think it's possible that they might have been drunk, which, if you know anything about orchestras, is perfectly possible, especially orchestras at that time. However, having said all that, I think this is slightly charming, this opening. I find it slightly charming. I think it's pretty impressive that Keith Emerson, although I think he might have had some help from the conductor, Joseph Eager, managed to put all of this together and to arrange it, As I said earlier, John Lord could have done it. I think Rick Wakeman could have done it. And, more recently we've had Tony Banks trying his hand at orchestral writing. I think it's got some nice twists and turns in it. So I think you can enjoy it just as long as, once again, you take it for what it is. Namely, the overture to a suite that doesn't exist. And yeah, I don't know if you'd want to listen to a whole album of this. Anyway, let's get on to Bridge 2. This is where it gets really exciting, I think. I suppose people know the sociological theory of deferred gratification. I wonder whether, the whole opening, the overture, is like it's a way of deferring the gratification that you get in the second part, thus augmenting it, A bit like tantric sex, something on which I'm not an expert. What I like about this, apart from the brilliant sound of the nice playing brilliantly, as usual, is the ineluctable shifts between all the little bits in it. It's full of lots and lots of it's a series of little surprises, but they all seem entirely logical, which again is sort of the essence of art, isn't it, really? That tension between the expected and the unexpected. I mean, for example, they start with, it's in G, I think, so they start with a G. Let me just play it. 5 bridges cross the Tyne. So that's the sort of 5 bridges fanfare there at the beginning, dun, da, 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 which starts on the keyboard, and then the voice comes in singing it, and over the chords G, C, and there's a pedal G in the bass. So the chord's changing while the bass note is remaining the same, and then the bass note changes. 5 bridges cross the Tyne, and the city sits close by. Song goes east, song goes south, and each one seems to cry. I can't remember the words. There's no good complaining about dirty air. There's nothing much else to breathe. So that shift is, where the bass note finally changes and the pedal opens out, is, as I say, ineluctable, but also somehow unexpected and therefore exciting. And that leads us into a variation, which is, it's no good shouting from 9 to 5 if you haven't got the guts to leave. If you do not want to leave, then you make yourself believe. Now at this point it's gone from G up to C. So what that indicates is that it's a, you've got key changes coming in here. Again, unexpectedly, but also entirely logically, and that's quite beautiful, And it is sort of classical, shows a classical kind of imagination, I suppose. I should also say that I think there's a programmatic significance here, because when the band comes in, they're playing a lot of cymbals and hi-hats, and then they sort of gradually add bits to it. The electric parts, if you like, the organ and the bass. And I think that sort of represents the water versus the bridge, the bridge being the industrial part. Maybe with the cars as well, why not? Which is also an industrial factor, isn't it? So I think they're playing a dialectic here all the time, not just between orchestra and band, but also between, nature and industry, which is nice, isn't it? Now, terrifically exciting, all of this whole section, and as I say, it kind of like flows and it kind of devolves into a keyboard solo, with a climax, very nice climax. Again with the pedal, that's to say the bass note's not changing. I mean, it's all terrifically satisfying, this. Then it stops, and then you go into bridge 3, right? Bridge 3 is beautiful, beautiful song. I think, again, unexpected but ineluctable key changes. It's got neo-romantic strings under it, this part. Sort of neo-romantic string arrangement from the orchestra. I think of this bit as being a bit like a hymn, like Jerusalem, which of course the LP covered later on. Or even maybe, I Vow to Thee, My Country, which is the hymn that's extracted from the Planet Suite, which I mentioned earlier on. And I think the way that this builds up represents really the first sort of apotheosis of this 18-minute piece. Because as I have explained various times, I think that any sidelong epic needs 2 apotheoses, and this is the first one. So I'll try and play it. La da 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 da, la 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 la. la 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 la. La 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 la. Again, you end up in the different keys of what you started in, and then they have to go back into it. But they can slam back into it. It's fine. It's fine. But yeah, beautiful, beautiful melody and harmony arrangements. Love it. The words are a hymn to Newcastle. As I said, in keeping with the theme of the hymn, they're a bit bad. Take me to Northumberland Street, where Northumberland people test their feet on a pavement on a crowded afternoon. And no one wants to change this, but I bet they'll do quite soon. That's not great, is it? But I think I sometimes wonder whether Lee Jackson wrote these in about five minutes before they went on stage. Anyway, fine. It doesn't really matter about words too much, does it? They never bother me that much, as long as they're not too obtrusive. This bit is actually, all this romantic bit is kind of interspersed, as I said earlier, with kind of jazz trio variations over the main chords, the ascending chords, because there's kind of ascending feel in the bass on the chords. Then so that kind of plays itself out. There's kind of back and forth between the jazz trio bits and the romantic bit. And then, again, it stops, and then we go into Bridge 4, which is, as I said, a brief section. This is a much faster jazz variation, sort of played on the piano. And it's, again, with lots of cymbals, I think, again, evoking the water, right? And then we go into Bridge 5, which, as I said, is a reprise of Bridge 2. I love the idea of reprising a bridge. Doesn't make any sense, does it? Anyway, and here they are accompanied by the brass section from the orchestra, presumably, and some added saxophones here, because I don't think the orchestra contains saxophones. Essentially, what they do here is they go through the whole exciting bit again. So you've got a nice ABA structure, which makes perfect sense in the context of a track like this. This is the kind of prog rock prototype structure that I was talking about earlier on. They repeat the lyrics, actually. And at the end, there's a... what is it? That section is kind of... I played earlier on, the C section, if you like, is extended a bit here. And I think it acts as a sort of second apotheosis to the track, because you need a second one, as I said. And it's got a sort of brass improv over it. And then they come back to a unison section to finish over this very fast sort of drum beat and everything. And then that's it. There's a little brass coda and then the final big note. But anyway, this is a beautiful piece of music, I think. Shouldn't be missed by prog fans, and in a way I think it's even ahead of the first ELP album, which Keith Emerson disbanded the Nice to form ELP, but I think the writing is more sophisticated on this track than it was on the first ELP album, where it's a bit sort of episodic. It's all a bit episodic. And in that sense, perhaps it forms a bridge with Tarkus, which is the second ELP album. But I must say I do prefer this to Tarkus, because I think the musical ideas are more seductive, really. All right, let's go to side 2. I'll be more succinct here if I can. We begin here with the Coralia Suite, band and orchestral arrangement of the Coralia Suite by Sibelius. I have a series of problems with this track. This is my first complaint on the album. There's a problem with the side lengths on this album. Side 2 is 9 minutes longer than side 1. Now, I thought they used to try to avoid that back then, because they had to do cassette copies in which it was useful for both of the sides to be the same length, because otherwise, you'd be left with an uncomfortable silence at the end of side 1 or side 2 of a cassette. So I don't know how they got around that here, but. Yes, it's side 2 is 9 minutes longer, which funnily enough is the precise length of the first track on side 2. and the Karelia Suite. Now, so I think they don't need this track. First of all, I'm not a huge fan of these classical covers that the Nice used to do. And the second track is also one, but I mean, you know, like, I can cope with one aside, but two aside seems excessive. You know, what's the Oscar Wilde quote from The Importance of Being Earnest? Losing one parent is, you know, a terrible shame. Losing two begins to look like carelessness. Well, you know. Mutatis mutandis, putting one classical cover on on an album, you know, is a shame, but two begins to look like carelessness. Did you get that joke? Anyway, okay, so, and, you know, they've already got a classical orchestra here on the stage, so they could have done a classical version of this. Do they really need a jazz rock rhythm section vamping along in the background? You know, plus at one point Lee Jackson actually goes so far as to play his bass with a bow, you know, a la Jimmy Page, you know, to add insult to injury, because the orchestral musicians must have wondered what he was doing, because they've got instruments that are specifically designed for that purpose, you know, and not to mention the fact that it's got, you know, it ends with Keith Emerson's usual sort of Hammond organ feedback, which is pretty much an assault on the ears. Actually, the orchestra must have wondered what the hell was going on at that point. Another problem with this is that they'd already done it. They'd done this on their previous album, or on the second album, I should say. So you really don't need it again. Also, the sound is not great here. I mean, I suppose the sort of jam in the middle, you've got jam in the middle, the band jam in the middle of this track is fairly coherent. And I think the tutti bit at the ending is quite exciting. But I just think this is all a bit unnecessary, this track. Track 2 is, again, a band orchestral arrangement of the scherzo bit from the third movement of Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, the Pathétique. I think this makes more sense, this one. You know, if nothing else, because they hadn't done it before. Also, Tchaikovsky is a very tuneful composer, so it's kind of poppy. Mind you, I suppose Sibelius is as well, in a way. But this also is. And, you know, I think as on side one of this album, what's quite nice about this one is they don't try to integrate the band and the orchestra. You know, it's a sort of back and forth, which I think is fine, you know, really. Again, Stumpy, Paul Stump, describes this as one of the bloodiest barneys between the rock and classical milieu on record, which I think is quite a funny comment. But yeah, I think it works okay, this piece, and the sound is a bit better. And it's got a great drum solo towards the end, which is typically mad and brilliant from the brilliant Brian Davidson. Keith Emerson is an amazing musician, as I've already said, but Brian Davidson is a brilliant drummer as well, I think, absolutely brilliant. And Lee Jackson's a really good musician as well. Some people, his bass playing is amazing. People criticise his voice, but I think his voice is fine. It's just a very particular kind of voice. And I think he does a reasonably enough job. I think the idea that they had to form ELP so that they could get a proper singer, i.e. Greg Lake, it's slight bit of marketing, I think, because I think Greg Lake is great, but I think Lee Jackson's fine. You know, it seems like a fairly safe pair of hands. It's just, as I say, it's a particular kind of voice, so maybe not as versatile as Greg Lake. But yeah, it's a good little drum solo here from Brian Davidson, not overextended, crucially. Now, track 3 is Country Pie by Bob Dylan, with segments from, I think, the 6th Brandenburg Concerto by Bach. This was also live, but recorded at the Fillmore East this time. You know, I love the idea of them going from Croydon, you know, in South London to New York. The life of a rock band. I don't want to be rude about Croydon, but it's not New York. Now, I think this is brilliant, this track. Absolutely brilliant. It's a real load of, a real gas, this track. They always gave good Dylan the Nice. Their versions of She Belongs to Me on the Nice, and their version of My Back Pages, which was on Elegy, the album after this, their final album, their Contractual Obligation album, as you say, were both brilliant, and this is brilliant as well. It's a good Dylan track anyway, this one, I think. I've always liked it, from Nashville Skyline, but I think they make it better with all their sort of ecumenical blowing, the nice, and they even give it a climax. So this is like a prog version of Bob Dylan. Again, I think this is the sort of structure which precipitates all of the prog rock that comes afterwards in the 70s. It's a short track. This is only 5 and a bit minutes, I think, but it's all in there. You know, so it's structurally interesting and diverse and concise, right? So it's great. I can't imagine anything better than, you know, a progged up Bob Dylan. So as you can see, the album's very much back on track by now, and it stays with it for the closer, One of Those People, which is a brilliant little closer, lovely kind of keyboard parts with the vocals overlaid, kind of funky track. A bit psych prog, so it's just kind of a callback to the Nice's first album. And in a sense, I suppose it kind of like balances out their career, you know. And so that's nice. I think when Keith Emerson relaxes, it's just, I don't know, it's so it seems like effortless for him to write brilliant material like this. Anyway, my only complaint about this track is the lyrics are slightly dodgy. You know, what is it? I'm one of those people who your father told your sister not to go out with, you know. So it's rather of the era, this one, I suppose you could say. Still, I suppose, you know, before, you know, sex predation was bad, or whatever it is, you know, quoth The Office. But I think it was still bad back then, actually. All right, good. Well, look, that said, lovely closer to a lovely album. So I suppose we can conclude here. I think this is the album, this is like the Nicest Abbey Road, I think. It's the album where they sum up all that they've done so far and all that's good in what they've done so far, and they show off all of their skills, you know, including setting up all the kind of writing, as I said earlier, that characterises the best 70s prog, you know. So it's a wonderful album. Check it out today. And thanks for listening. I hope that was somehow enlightening. And I'll see you on the next episode of Crapper, presumably coming up very soon. Thanks for your attention. Ta-ra!